Hello, Bernie Wall here. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm an IELTS trainer specialising in working with students who need bands 7 and 8 in their exam. And in this short video today, I want to look at the speaking part of the test and give you 3 pointers that I hope will help you to perform well in the speaking. So remember, the speaking part of the exam is structured like the rest of the exam, and you need to give your very best performance in each part in order to achieve a high score. So let me, I've prepared a short presentation which I'll share with you now, and we'll look at 3 things that I think, if you consider and practice these things, will help you to achieve a good score in your speaking exam. So, what's important about the speaking? I think the most important thing that you need to remember is that it is a test of communication. And that means that it's not just about you, but it's also about the examiner. So the examiner will need some space to ask their questions and perhaps in the third part to make the odd comment. So it's communication, not just you giving a speech. And also that aspect of communication, of you being able to produce a good, full, logical answer to the questions is more important, I think, than complete accuracy. So communication first. Accuracy is important. The more accurate you are, the fewer mistakes you make, the higher the score. But I have come across many, many students who actually were really good communicators and spoke very well, yet fell down in the exam because they were constantly just looking for exactly the right word, exactly the right grammatical sentence, and this caused them to be less communicative. And so the score reflected that. So it's important to put communication first and then accuracy a little bit second. The second place I feel where a lot of students fall down is in part 2. Now, part 2 is your chance to take the floor, because it's down to you to give this little speech, this little talk. And so you're wasting an opportunity if you don't perform well in part 2, and even more so if you don't practice well your part 2. And the third thing is, obviously, you need to use great language. Now, the only way that you can bring these things together, the communication, the accuracy, the great language, is by practice. And so practicing this a lot will help you to bring all of the strands together so that you not only communicate well, but you also use really good language and you are fluent and accurate. So let's start with the communication side of the speaking. It goes without saying, the better your language, the more varied your vocabulary, the more sophisticated your sentence structures, the higher your score will be. So that is important to get a high band, but overall it is a test of communication. So it's important to listen carefully to the questions, make sure you've got exactly the right answer to the question that you were given, because what you don't want is for the examiner to repeat the question. That's not good. So listen carefully in the first instance and then provide an appropriate response as spontaneously as you can and as full as you can without overstating. So you don't have to keep going on and on. Just answer the question fully, spontaneously and accurately. It's better to make small errors than to do a lot of hesitation, because the problem with a lot of hesitation is the examiner's not sure whether you just don't have the ability to answer the question or whether you didn't understand the question in the first place. So if you make the odd little mistake, it's fine, so long as the overall communication is good. But obviously, the fewer mistakes you make, the better the score. So fluency is important. Don't have long pauses before you answer the question. Try not to repeat the question to the examiner, because that's not natural communication. So think about, how best can I answer this question? Okay, the second thing that I want you to consider is part 2. I find quite often, as I mentioned before, that a lot of students fall down on part 2. They get nervous, they run out of things to say, and they are very hesitant, or they repeat things a lot. So it's quite important to practice this. And the good news is that part 2 is the easiest part of the test to practice by yourself. So it's all down to you. And it is. The examiner is there to listen and to be interested in the story you're going to tell. Try to use all of the 2 minutes if you can, and part of your practice should be gauging roughly how much 2 minutes is. The more you give the examiner, the more they have to decide on your band. If you don't say much, then they won't have an awful lot of language to assess. So try and use the whole 2 minutes if you can. Tell a good story. So think about your story. What happened? Who was there? How did you feel? And really see it as a story. Have a picture in your head of what happened. Make it logical. So start at the beginning of your story and go to the end of your story. If it's about a journey, start with the beginning of that journey. How did you travel? Where did you travel? Who was with you? Where were you going? Why were you going? All of these things, make it logical and try and make it interesting. If there was something funny happened, explain about that funny thing. If you had some emotion, if you were very excited, or if you were anticipating the destination, for example, try and bring some of that across. It helps with your language, and it also helps to get the examiner interested. I was an examiner myself, and I can tell you that where a student was giving me a very interesting story, it was a lot easier to assess them than a student who was very nervous and hesitant and the story didn't hang together. So try and get the examiner interested in your story. The cue card is there for a reason. All of these exams in the IELTS, the different parts of the IELTS, have been constructed by people who are experts in examinations. And they know that giving you this cue card with a few pointers in a particular order is going to help you to create a story that you can tell in an interesting way to the examiner for up to 2 minutes. So that cue card is there to help you. So use it. I would say if you say roughly 3 things about each point on the cue card, it will give you around 2 minutes of talking. It's very rough, but it works about that. Follow the suggested steps. Again, remember it's there to help you. You don't have to use it, it's not compulsory, but in the situation of the speaking exam where you're probably feeling a little bit nervous and the examiner's sitting in front of you, it helps to have this little pattern that you can follow. So try and follow it if you can, and use the time before you start to speak to really prepare what you're going to say about each of the steps. Keep going and pace yourself. So try and have a sequence, you know, first, this is what happened. After that, use this kind of language to organize the events in your story. And have a picture in your head of exactly what happened on that day or at that time, or whatever it is you're asked to explain. Because if you have a visual picture in your head of what happened, it helps you to explain it. And imagine you're telling this story to a colleague at work, or somebody in your family, or a friend. How would you tell it to them? And try and do it in a similar way. And then practice. And the best way to practice part 2 is to record yourself. So choose a topic, practice it, record your little speech, your 2 minutes, listen, be critical, Practice it again and make it better. So every time you're looking to improve it, then record it a second time, and then again be critical and see if you can improve it even more. And I would do it at least 3 times. You can do it more. I've had some students who've tried recording their part 2 maybe up to 10 times, and you could see each time it got better and better. So it is something that you can very easily do by yourself. And the third thing is, obviously, the better your language, the more varied your language, the better your range of sentence structure and vocabulary and use of idiom, the higher the band. So the more you practice, the more you'll be able to incorporate better language. And if you focus on what you want to say, then that language, if you've practiced it enough, will just come automatically. So there are very many different scenarios that you're asked to talk about in the IELTS, and you need to be able to do that. So firstly, they often ask you about the past. How were things in your grandparents' day, or how were things 100 years ago? So can you talk fluently and well about the past? Can you sequence your tenses? Do you know where you need to use present perfect or past perfect or past simple? Practice this, talking about the past. Talking about the future, they will often ask you, how do you think this will look in 50 years? So practice talking about the future, using the right tenses, using the right vocabulary. Speculation is something that is also asked in, especially part 3, asking you to speculate about things and sometimes to imagine things. So using things like modal verbs, would, could, should, and also conditional sentences, if this were to happen, or if this happens. So think about that kind of language and practice it. Use idioms where you can. This is the place where you can use idioms. Obviously, you don't want to memorize a lot of random idioms and then just throw them in willy-nilly. They have to be appropriate. But if there is an idiom you know and it seems appropriate to what you want to say, then use it, because the examiners will take note of that. Something else that's very, very helpful in the speaking is to use phrasal verbs. Now, phrasal verbs normally you wouldn't use in writing, and you're probably told by your teachers don't use them, except perhaps in an informal letter at general training. But in the speaking, phrasal verbs are great because they are very, very natural to native speakers. So think about using phrasal verbs in all aspects of your speaking. Check out the vocabulary for specific topics. You can look back at topics that come up regularly in the speaking, just like in the writing, and then try and learn some of that vocabulary so that if you get that topic in your speaking, you have that vocabulary on tap to use. And if you feel you have any pronunciation issues, then practice that too, because pronunciation is one of the band descriptors. And if there are any aspects of your pronunciation which might cause a problem for the examiner, they will mark you down. So if you feel there is something, then just practice it. Generally speaking, so long as it's clear and the examiner can understand everything, they won't mark you down too much on pronunciation, although they will be aware of any pronunciation errors that you make. And as it's a descriptor, they will be listening out for it. And try to use markers. I had one student once who, when they were asked for their opinion, always said, oh yes, I believe this is the case for 3 reasons. And then he would enumerate his reasons, firstly, secondly, thirdly. It's a really good technique for giving you some thinking time. Now, obviously, you need to come up with 3 reasons, but you might just have 2 reasons. But it does help you to organize your language and organize your ideas. So where you can use these sorts of markers, it's quite a useful technique. And finally, a word on practice. It really does. The more you practice, the better it will become. It's true of the speaking, it's true of the writing. These are both productive skills. So the more you practice, the better. And where you focus on things, so if you focus on your part two will improve. If you focus on your vocabulary will improve. It always is the case. So you have to practice in order to develop both of these, both the speaking and the writing. You cannot do it by osmosis. You must actively practice. So the better your practice, the better your performance in the exam. And it takes time. In order to do all the things I've mentioned in this video, you need time. So don't leave it till the last minute. When you start preparing for your exam, you should be working on everything. Your reading, your listening, your writing, and your speaking. And sadly, I find quite often that students spend an awful lot of time on listening and reading and leave their speaking and writing to the very last minute. And guess what happens? The reading and the listening score well, and the writing and speaking score less well. So remember, you have to have all the balls in the air at all times in order to achieve those high band 7 and 8 scores. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that. So I have, as always, written an article about this, which gives a little bit more information, and you can find that on my website, IELTSlearningtips.com, where you can also find some other resources to help you with your IELTS preparation. So thank you for watching this. I hope that that will be useful to you, and I'll see you on the next video.